but a child will manipulate in order to gain a semblance of control. They'll manipulate to get needs met, because if I feel that I'm not safe, if I feel that my needs aren't met, then I'm going to manipulate a situation so that I can take care of myself. So what I would encourage you to do is to push pause on this video for just a few minutes and take a minute and do a quick timeline of a child that you're caring for. When you can write out their timeline and really take a step back and look at the overall picture, it's much easier to say, what is this child's negative belief system? Again, it could be something that I've mentioned, it could be something on the PowerPoint, or it might be something completely different. And what is this negative belief system? How is this child communicating this to me? Is it through lying? Is it through stealing? Is it through disrespect? Is it through poor boundaries? So go ahead and push pause and just take a couple minutes to do that now. Let's go over one more just really quick hypothetical situation. This is just a child that I made up, but unfortunately it's something that happens all the time. Let's say that you have a child who's 2 and is removed due to neglect. The parents were using substances, and the child is placed in a shelter. And then they find family, and so they remove that child from the shelter and place them with family. And 2 months later, they determine that the family is inappropriate for the child to live with, so that they remove the child from family, place them back in a shelter, and then they find a foster family a few months later. By this time, the child's behaviors have become pretty big. The foster family wasn't really well equipped for handling the intensity of the behaviors, and so the child is bounced from the home they're removed. So then this child goes to a group home, stays there for a year, and then they find another foster home, because ideally that's where we want kids, is in foster homes. Well, now this child is 10, has been in care the majority of their life, and has been in 12 different foster homes. And in that 5 years of education, they've now been in maybe 6 schools. So what are some things that you can expect for that child to believe about themselves? They might believe I have no sense of control. They might believe I don't belong. I'm a failure. I'm worthless. There's no sense of security in my life. Sometimes when I ask this question, people will say, when the question is, what's the negative belief? People will say, I don't have others to care for me. That wouldn't be a negative belief. That would be a belief of other people. That's what you believe of other people. So if in any of this your response has been, there aren't people to take care of me, the belief would be, I'm not safe or I'm not secure. That's the self-belief, okay? So then whenever fears arise around that, that's when we're going to see the behavior. So for our hypothetical child that we just talked about, what type of behaviors might you expect to see from a child who believes that they're a failure, who believes that they don't belong or that they're worthless, who believes that they're not lovable? We have two different sides of the spectrum on this. You might see a child in their hyperarousal, which would be the aggressive system, who is verbally aggressive, physically aggressive, they lie, they manipulate, they are very hostile. Or you might see a child who is in the hypoarousal, who's in that passive defense. And what you might see is a child who's very perfectionistic, a child who's very compliant. You might see a child who is suicidal or self-harming. You might see a child in that hypoarousal, that passive defense, who is using substances to numb. You might see that child who has this constant smile of like, everything's great, everything's good. And I've worked with kiddos like that before who have just had horrific past, and whenever they see you, whenever they come into my office, excuse me, they say, everything's good, everything's okay. And you know that internally it's not. There's a lot of stuff that's going on internally. So, for instance, in schools, when kids are asked to turn in homework, it's like slapping that sunburn. It triggers that fear that I'm a failure, and so they freeze up and don't turn in their homework. Well, then they come home to a family who's frustrated that they didn't turn in their homework. And really, the family's response will either validate for that child that they're a failure, or they'll come in and be supportive and help that child work through that and teach them a better way. So some of the behaviors that come out for children as a way to protect their sunburn is lying, stealing, tantrums, control battles, defiance, opposition. Some kids will hoard food or steal food. Where the shift occurs is we want to begin to shift the mindset that these are bad behaviors to this is exactly what that child needs to be doing to protect themselves. So imagine for a second that we put aloe on our sunburn to help us to feel better. I've had a few people tell me they put ice cubes on their sunburn. They rub ice cubes on their skin to help them to feel better. So let's say that lying and stealing and manipulation are a child's ice cubes. That's what they're using to help themselves to feel better. And we get frustrated because we don't like lying, stealing, and manipulation. So that child comes in and we yell at them and we lecture them and we tell them how terrible it is that they would do those things. Basically what we're saying to that child is, the way that you're helping yourself to feel better, you can't do that anymore. And what we fail to do oftentimes is to give them new skills, to give them new ways, more effective ways to help that sunburn to feel better. And so we can't replace those ice cubes until we have new ones. And so to have the expectation on the child that you're going to stop lying, stealing, and manipulating today, and then you're just going to have to sit there in pain with your sunburn, is not really a realistic one. In fact, if we do that, what we'll find is that they're just going to find other unhealthy ice cubes for those behaviors. However, if we can come alongside them and say, you know what? I understand that you're using these ice cubes. We're going to start learning different ones so that you can find better ice cubes to use. But in the meantime, let's try and work with this, okay? And so we want to really make it a safe conversation for kids. We want to empower them to use their voice in that rather than just shaming them for what they're doing. Again, it's 100% reactive. Kids aren't waking up in the morning saying, I'm going to make my caregiver's life hell today. They really are in this state of survival. So let's take a minute and watch a quick video of what is happening with behaviors. So what is it that we're looking at in that video? That is a video of neurological networking. There's a term, and we'll use this term again later today, that what fires together wires together. So when a child engages in a behavior, it creates a neurological firing, which creates a wiring. So those neurons will now wire together. And the more and more that behavior is used as a survival skill, the stronger of a neurological network it becomes. And so the stronger, the more automatic that behavior will come, the more ingrained that it will come. Think about learning to use your learning your alphabet for the first time, or when a child learns their alphabet the first time. They really fumble through it. They might know a few letters, or they might mix up the letters, but the more and more that child says that alphabet over and over and over again, the more ingrained it becomes, till eventually, my guess is most adults could say the alphabet, and as they're saying the alphabet, their brain could be somewhere completely different. It will come out automatically without actually having to think through that process. So that would be a neural network. We have a neural network for the alphabet to make it a very automatic process that we don't have to think through. This is kind of a difficult concept to digest, though, because what it's suggesting is that what a child is doing is exactly what they need to be doing. When a child is lying and stealing and manipulating because that's what they've needed to do to survive, that is exactly the correct response for them. I'm not making the statement that it is moral, that it is legal, but it's the exact right response for that child. And again, this is why taking a child from one environment to another does not prune off, does not get rid of that neural network. It takes a lot of work to create new neural networks. Think about when a baby learns to walk the first time. A child just doesn't say, I think I'm going to walk today. We couldn't go up to a little baby and start lecturing them about the importance of walking. It takes time. They stumble, they fumble, they have a caregiver who's there to help them up along the way. And the more and more that child practices it, the better they get, until eventually they don't have to think about it. All of us adults walk around and we're not left foot, right foot, balance. It's just something that happens very, very naturally. So when kids come in, we want to teach them a better way, and it's going to be a fumble, it's going to be difficult at times. I like to think of it, let's imagine for a second that you're standing in front of a field, and that in that field there's grass that maybe comes up about knee height, and you decide that you want to make a path through this field. In fact, you're going to give this field to your child. You want your child to build a path through this field. So you're standing at the edge of this path, looking at the grass that comes about knee height. If you stand there and lecture your child about how to make a path, is that going to make the path? You could tell them all of the right tools that they need to make a path. Is that going to make a path? If you stood there and you scolded your child over and over again and lectured them over and over again about making a path, is that going to make a path? If you said, you know what, this is taking you too long, you are defying me, you are not listening to me because the path's not made, you're going to be grounded from your tablet. You're going to be sent to your room. Is that going to make the path? What makes the path is actually holding that child's hand and walking down through that field. And the more and more we walk through that field, the more solid that path becomes, till eventually it will be a very clear path. So as soon as you walk up to it, or as soon as that child walks up to that path, they'll know exactly where to go down. And so what we'll be doing is teaching children how to create a path, not yelling, not lecturing, not punishing them, but giving them and teaching them new ways to create a path. So some of the things that we see from children who have gone through trauma is they have a very hard time relaxing, and they have a very low tolerance for waiting for things. I watch kids sometimes and I just see their little minds getting wrapped around something. Let's say that there's a field trip on Friday and their brain just gets stuck there and they're like, how many more sleeps? How many more minutes? What should I wear? What do you think it's going to be like? Who's going to ride on the bus with me? Are you going to be there with me? And for kids, if you think about that, and if you think about their little brain just getting stuck on that, how exhausting and fatiguing that is. So then they may be communicating through their behavior, I'm tired right now. My brain has been stuck on something for days now, and I'm just exhausted from that. But that's one of the things that happens when kids have been through trauma. They also can't tolerate frustration, the slightest amount of frustration, and they're in a meltdown on the floor. This can be very present when doing homework. If a child's doing their math work and they get one problem wrong and you go to help correct it, and all of a sudden they're melting down because they couldn't handle the frustration of not being able to do that math problem. Some kids are happy one minute and angry the next. When my husband and I fostered, we had two siblings in our home, and literally when we first got them, it was, I'm not really sure what we're going to get in this minute, because one minute they might be happy and huggy, and the next minute they're in a ball in the corner of the room crying, or the next minute they're throwing things and raging. And so again, even to go back to that continuous trauma, when that happens and we're not sure what we're going to get, we can end up running at this constant level of anxiety and end up blowing out our own circuits. But for kiddos, that's not their fault. That's just one of the symptoms of trauma. Again, they also become very easily upset, and often that's linked to not being able to tolerate frustration. Kiddos also have a lot of always or never thinking. You might have had a child in your home where it's you always, I never. That actually is a symptom of rigid thinking. And when a child goes into rigid thinking, a couple things happen. One, it indicates that they're going into their survival brain. When they lose that flexibility to think beyond the always and the never, that's indicating there's survival going on. So then that's going to cue to us, this is a way they're communicating. What is the unmet need and what is causing them to feel like they need to go into survival? What happens for us, though, is when kids go into always and never thinking and get rigid, the caregivers often can go into always and never and get just as rigid. And so as the intentional adult, it's important for us to remember and maintain that we are the responsible adult that needs to stay regulated in this. And we'll actually talk about a little bit more about that in one of the other sections upcoming. Kiddos from traumatic environments also have a lot of learning and memory problems. They struggle learning things and remembering things. Keep in mind, going back to our hand model of the brain, this thinking part of our brain where reasoning happens and planning happens and problem solving happens, all shut off. So guess what? When you're on the playground with a child and you get in a fight with them, it takes problem solving skills to figure that fight out. So oftentimes kids struggle with relationships because they're not able to access that part of their brain. When you're doing math requires problem solving. So if that part of your brain isn't online or is minimally online, likely that child will struggle with math. As a clinician, one of the frustrating things is the first thing when we have a child-family team meeting, we talk about the child's grades, because in my mind, the child may not be in a place to learn. And to have that expectation isn't always realistic, because their learning and memory parts of their brain aren't functioning or aren't quite online as children that are in healthy environments. So something else that we commonly see is that emotions interfere with a thought process. Again, this can become very problematic in school, because if a child is having a lot of big emotions in class, a lot of worry, a lot of sadness, a lot of hurt, they're really going to struggle with keeping up what's going on. They're really going to be able to struggle with thinking through things because those emotions become so big. We had one child in our home, and she had this class project, and I don't remember exactly the specifics of the class project, but basically what it came to was that on a paper, it had written she had written something along the lines of, I worry a lot about my mom. And to think that that's something that's coming out at school, and how much is she thinking about that in school? And so often kids will deflect or avoid the classroom through goofing off or through becoming distracted, because it's a lot easier to get in trouble from goofing off and being distracted than to have to confront that I have no idea what's going on because my emotions are way too big right now. I have a hard time keeping up and thinking through what's happening in the classroom because I have so much going on in my thought and in my emotions. Some things that happen socially for children is that they have poor boundaries. They need to be touched all the time. Again, kids will do whatever they can to get those connection needs met. We as human beings have an innate need for connection. One of the things that doesn't sit well with me when I work with families and other professionals is when we talk about kids having attention-seeking behaviors. I would actually shift that to a connection-seeking behaviors. As human beings, we all need connection to thrive. We all need connection for our well-being. And so kids will seek attention in what seems to be attention in inappropriate ways, but really it's them saying, I need connection. I need someone to hug me. I need someone to show me love. And what happens is we get frustrated because we see the attention seeking, and we don't want our kids to attention seek. But what they really need is that connection. But they're going to look for it in inappropriate or ineffective ways because nobody's ever taught them how to seek that out in more appropriate ways. In child development, I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent here. In child development, a parent and a child engage in what's called a serve and return process. Basically, if you could imagine a child standing here, I'm going to serve a child facial expression when they're a baby, and they're going to serve it back to me. So I might pick up that baby and I might smile really big and say, hi. And when I do that, that child's going to look at me and go, ah. Or I might look at that child and I might stick my tongue out like this, blah, 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 blah. And that child's going to look back at me and go, blah, 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 blah. This is a serve and return process. I'm serving a child a facial expression and they're returning it back to me. And as that child grows and matures, those serve and return process interactions will become more complex. So if I serve to my child anger every time that they act out, my child is eventually going to learn to return that back to me. They're going to learn to return anger back to me. When I serve my child words, like mama, dada, eventually that child will learn to serve those back to me. And this is a serve and return process. When a child hasn't been taught effective ways and helpful ways to seek connection, they're going to seek it in any way that they can, because they haven't had someone to engage them in that serve and return process. And in the times that they have, it may not have been effective because they've been in that survival part of their brain where that relationship piece was shut off. It was not online for them. Other social difficulties are kids want to be in control. We've talked a little bit about that, but they really struggle with authority figure because they feel like the only way that they can survive is to maintain control. Some kids, if they don't have control in their environment, if it's a toxic environment, literally feel that their life will crumble and will fall apart. So when they come into our homes and we try to take away that control, it's like saying, let me take away this ice cube. That sense of control. That way that you've learned to survive, that you've learned to hold your world together, I'm going to take that away from you. Kids tend to lack relational trust, and they also have a constant demand that others prove themselves trustworthy. And they need to do it now. If you tell a child that they're going to get something, again, it's where their little brains get kind of stuck, but they have a very low tolerance for waiting for things. And one of the things that we really want to strive for is how do we build that tolerance? How do we teach them it's okay to wait, but without poking at that sunburn, without causing them to become so triggered that they're going to start acting out behaviorally. So all of these symptoms negatively impact relationships. When a child is fighting and raging and lying and stealing, that's not the place where, as caregivers, we want to say, come here, you sweet little thing, and give me a hug. That can become very, very challenging for caregivers because those are the exact behaviors that are saying, someone come help me, and at the same time saying, everybody stay away from me because I don't feel safe. So Karen Purvis, who is one of my favorite people in understanding child trauma and behaviors and how to meet child's needs despite those behaviors that negatively impact relationships, said, certainly your child may exhibit manipulative or assertive behavior, but instead of faulting them for it, respect that it enabled them to survive. So think about it. Rather than faulting our children for these behaviors, admire them because that's what has enabled them to survive.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
So what you just saw is a video from the Harvard Center of the Developing Child on toxic stress. What it was really important to notice about that video, though, is them talking about the environment and how the environment helps to buffer stressful situations. So we're going to spend this next module discussing the importance of the environment and the parent-child interaction or the caregiver-child interaction. We have this long history in our culture of thinking of children as resilient. And I really want to challenge that and weigh resiliency versus malleability, so a child's adjustment to the environment. So our understanding historically has been kids are resilient. If something happens, it's okay, they'll bounce back. However, kids, while there are some genetic components to resiliency, by and large, resiliency is what I would like to consider gifted to a child. So the International Resiliency Project determined that when children had 3 factors, they tended to do better off in the face of adversity, in the face of trauma in the long run. The first thing that they determined was when a child had trusting relationships, when they had even just one caregiver that was supportive of them, that met their physical and their emotional needs, those kids did much better off in the long run when a traumatic event happened, when an episode of trauma happened. And even in my own work, I've seen that. When children come in and they have gone through one episode of sexual abuse or in a car accident, if they had a stable, loving, supportive caregiver at home, we didn't see, or I didn't see, a lot of the symptomology of trauma that I would see from children that didn't have that same support. The second thing that determined resiliency in children was structure and rules at home. So in all of this, even as we talk about behavior, I think it's worthy to note that what I'm not saying is let your child do whatever they want, let them manipulate, let them lie, and let those things go unaddressed, because what we know is one of the things that determines resiliency is a child being able to have rules and structure. Rules and structure say to a child, you're safe. I'm here to keep you safe. It gives a child boundaries to operate within. My son, as he was learning to write, at his school, they would just give a little box with no lines in it, just a box, and they would have a child write their word in it. And when he would write, what that would look like was, let's say he was going to write the word cat, he might have a little C or a big A that extended over the top of the box, and then a T that kind of went out to the side of the box. And as he struggled through writing and figuring out how to fit within that box, one day I walked up to his little empty box and I drew dashed lines straight through it to draw a boundary within that middle mark. And when I drew that for him, his letters were much more consistent and were able to stay in the box. Because when I drew that boundary for him, basically I gave him a concept of what he could operate in. And when kids lack structure and rules, it feels very chaotic. It can be very anxiety producing. And this is on a side note, not rigid rules where we're taking all of the child's sense of control away. We're talking rules that are there to keep a child safe, rules that are there to help them flourish in their mental health. The third thing that they found in the International Resiliency Project was children that had role models also tended to do better off. When they had people that modeled appropriate relationships, that modeled healthy interactions in the face of adversity, they tended to do much better. So kids that had trusting relationships, rules and boundaries, and role models. If you took a child and put them in a negative situation, that child, if they had those three things, did much better off even 10 years later than children in a very similar situation or in the same situation that didn't have those things. They tended to struggle and show a lot more symptomology of stress, which when you consider environmental trauma, going all the way back to our first module, one of the traumas was an environmental trauma. And so what we're doing is we're trying to prevent that environmental trauma by giving a child a healthy, supportive caregiver. So in the environment, there seems to be a link between a caregiving environment and the expression in dopamine and the serotonin system, the transport system. So when the caregiving environment is a solid, stable environment, when it's good enough, children are much more likely to have good transporter systems, whereas in less good or not good enough environments, it leads to maladaptive transporter systems and a greater risk for anxiety, depression, and unstable mood. Caregivers don't have to be perfect. They just need to be good enough. And so really that's what we're looking at. When a caregiver can provide good enough care, then the child will have better transporters for the dopamine and serotonin level. Dopamine and serotonin are your feel-good chemicals. They help to regulate the body and they help us to have that warm, fuzzy feeling. Those would be the chemicals that secrete in the social engagement system. When children are born, what we know is that every child comes with the potential to just flourish and sprout as long as they have decent caregiving. When the caregiving system is breaking down, that's when we see the negative impact. So in the environment, let's talk about why this environment is so important. We know that it affects the release of dopamine and serotonin. It also leads to greater instability, emotional instability, and greater reactivity and impulsivity. And this has to do with the myelin-making cells. To go even more scientific, we have alpha-2 and delta-1 protein production, and that's restricted when there is developmental trauma. So when that environmental trauma is occurring, those proteins are restricted, and this actually increases the risk for obesity. And finally, there's actually new research linking epigenetic change, and we're going to talk a little bit about that very long word epigenetics in the DNA that is linked to Alzheimer's. It's also linked to, there's a relationship there between diabetes, okay? So we're going to take a minute and we're going to just watch a short video on the epigenome and understanding the environment, why the environment's so important, and some of those lasting effects.
DNA contains the instructions for building all the parts of the body. But DNA is only half the story. The DNA in our bodies is wrapped around proteins called histones. Both the DNA and histones are covered with chemical tags. This second layer of structure is called the epigenome. The epigenome shapes the physical structure of the genome. It tightly wraps inactive genes, making them unreadable. It relaxes active genes, making them easily accessible. Different sets of genes are active in different cell types. The DNA code remains fixed for life, but the epigenome is flexible. Epigenetic tags react to signals from the outside world, such as diet and stress. The epigenome adjusts specific genes in our genomic landscape in response to our rapidly changing environment.
So the video you just saw basically was a video indicating that we have our DNA set for life, but what our DNA is wrapped in is this epigenome, and that epigenome determines which DNA are activated and which DNA are not activated, which, to link it back to, now we're seeing a link between diabetes through this epigenome. This is going to, through the epigenome, they have been able to trace the effects of trauma for generations. That means that children are experiencing some of the same trauma responses due to trauma that happened 4 generations ago. So the environment is so important, okay? And so through that epigenome, we can adjust both negatively and positively. And that environment and providing the child with the proper environment is so important. All right, so let's talk about different environments. There is a man named Jeffrey Youngs, and he studied different family environments. What I would encourage you as you listen to these different environments is to determine, do any of these environments stand out, or do you relate closely with one of them? Because what we know is that when the environment that we grow up in is likely going to be similar to the environment that we provide for our children. I would encourage you to take it lightheartedly, but really reflect, is any of this coming into my parenting, okay? And then also, what environment did the child I'm caring for come from, okay? The other thing to note about these 5 environments that we're going to talk about is that the environment can be different for each child in the home, and that determines how the parent related to the child. So you may have one parent who is may have a parent who's very permissive with one child, and with another child, they are very distant and removed. And so those 2 children, even though they're in the same environment, are going to experience that very differently. So let's look at our first environment. These are toxic environments, again studied by Jeffrey Youngs. The first one is disconnection and rejection. What we see in this home, it's marked by abandonment or a sense of abandonment. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that child was actually abandoned, but there's a sense of abandonment. There is the parent is very removed. They're not caring for the child's emotional needs, and there's instability in the home. There's a high level of mistrust. People don't feel that they can trust each other. Also, that what occurs is emotional deprivation. There's deprivation of nurturance. So there's an absence of attention, an absence of affection, warmth, or companionship. Really, it is this high disconnect within the family. There's a deprivation of empathy. The caregivers don't offer understanding to the child. Oftentimes, if there's a child that's crying, they'll say, the parent just wants them to stop. Stop, stop, stop. You need to be done with that, and so forth. There's an absence of listening, of talking. Often in this family is where we'll see the sweeping under the rug. We just don't talk about things. It's not safe to share feelings with each other. And then there's a deprivation of protection. There's an absence of strength, of direction, or guidance from the caregiver. The caregiver isn't coming alongside and mentoring and teaching the child. The child is basically left to their own to figure life out. What comes from this, though, for children is just a sense of defectiveness and shame. And sometimes that actually comes from the adult's only sense of their own sense of defectiveness or shame. And ultimately, each family member is left feeling isolated or alienated. So some of the behaviors that we see coming from this environment are the constant monitoring of others. Because when people aren't showing affect, if they're not displaying what their emotions are, people from this environment get really good at reading just the very small cues in body language and facial expressions that may go unnoticed by other people. When people do show intense emotions, it becomes very upsetting. There's a very low level of tolerance for emotion. Dan Siegel talks about this window of tolerance that builds when a child is born. And that window of tolerance is the ability to tolerate other people's emotions. And that it begins again to form at birth. And the more that we interact and engage with each other with appropriate emotions, with appropriate affect. So as parents, there are times we're going to get frustrated. Are we able to show that child frustration in an appropriate way? And if we are, that's going to build that child's level of tolerance to handle another person's frustration. Well, in environment one, if people aren't showing emotion, when someone feels emotion, it becomes very overwhelming because they just don't have a window of tolerance to tolerate those big feelings. Also, because of that sense of disconnection and rejection from this environment comes this sense or the feeling that the people within this environment must be liked and approved by others. They're constantly seeking that approval or to make other people happy, to be liked. They often take responsibility for other people's welfare and their emotional well-being. They are constantly on alert for feeling distressed or uncomfortable. So they don't like to feel, people from this environment don't like to feel distressed. They don't like to feel comfortable, or they don't like to feel big emotions. I have heard people coming out of this environment, once they learn that it's okay and it's safe to feel feelings, they almost feel bipolar, because when they feel something and they allow themselves to feel something, it feels really, really big because their mind and their body aren't used to feeling that. They at times feel fearful when there are signs of conflict or aggression. These tend to be our people that avoid conflict at all costs. They try to anticipate what other people's needs and desires are and to fulfill those, and they work really hard to fulfill those. And part of that is, I'm going to fill this person's desires now so that there's not conflict later, so that there's not this big emotional upheaval later, because I can't handle the conflict, I can't handle the emotional upheaval. They feel like they must meet expectations of other people all the time. And oftentimes even to the point where they sacrifice their own needs or for the welfare of others. And for children, they sacrifice their own needs for the welfare of the parents. What comes from this environment, though, even as we talk about feeling the need to sacrifice the self to care for others, is that people in this environment tend to be highly controlling of others, and can also be very, very critical of other people. They aren't easily satisfied. It's hard to satisfy, almost as though nothing's good enough. and then they take offense very, very easily. Our second environment, this is environment 2, is what we call impaired autonomy and performance. What we see in this environment is a high dependence on others, so much so that there's almost this sense of incompetence. I can't act, I can't function without you because I'm not capable. So there's just this belief that that a person isn't capable or competent just to handle even daily responsibilities. So these are your people that are going to be calling. It's your teenage child who's going to be calling mom saying, you know, I was thinking about spending $1 on a candy bar. Do you think that's okay for me to do? And really not being able to make even some of the small decisions. They feel almost helpless when things start changing in the environment because they don't feel like they have the competence or the ability to handle it on their own. What we see also in this environment is that they're more vulnerable to harm or to illness. Sometimes they're exaggerated fears and worries and concerns. They think of all the catastrophes that could happen, all the losses that could happen. We all have this sense of who we are, this sense of self. What happens in this environment, though, is we lose a sense of self. We're no longer able to see ourselves as separate. The clinical way that we refer to this is enmeshment. We become enmeshed with another person. Our identity is no longer separate from each other. In a family system, what ideally we want to see is we have a family system, and in that system we see individuals operating for the family good and depending on each other for the family good independently. So I can be my own person, but I can still depend on others as I'm my own person. We call that interdependence. We're relying on one another as our own soul selves, as our own soul entities. In our environment 2, we see excessive emotional involvement, constantly needing to be close, again, not being able to make any decisions without the other person, definitely not having any individual thoughts. Everybody has to think the same way. Everybody has to be aligned on everything. And so from that comes just really an underdeveloped sense of who we are, an underdeveloped sense of what our identity is, because we're not able to identify ourselves as separate from the other people in the family. And so in this environment, what that really leads to is this sense of failure, this constant lull and belief that in some way I must have failed, and I will inevitably always fail, or there's something at the core of who I am that just fundamentally is a failure or inadequate. There's a belief that the people in this environment, that they believe that they're stupid, that they're untalented, that they're ignorant, and they really just don't have any value to offer others. Some of the behaviors that we see that come from environment 2 is children see themselves as extensions of the parent. They really aren't able to see themselves as their own person. Again, if we go to Erik Erikson's stages of development, the first is trust versus mistrust, and then right under that is autonomy versus independence. Autonomy versus shame. And at that point, around 2 to 3 years old, what we see is a child now is seeing themselves as a separate being. And as that child ages, more and more they see themselves as separate from their parents. An infant sees they are in existence, they're an extension of the parent because they rely so much on that parent for survival. But as they age, eventually we want to see them finding their own selves until eventually when they go into their teenage years where they start forming that identity. Well, in environment 2, that never really happens. That child is never really able to develop past that infant stage of I'm not an extension of you and I'm my own being. They must attend to and admire their parents all the time. Whatever their parents say goes. Whatever they like, I like. Whatever they do, that's what I'm going to do too. And they will never, or very rarely, show any type of independence on autonomy. And in the event that they do, it's frowned upon. They aren't given the freedom to explore themselves as an individual person. Because they're an extension of their parents, oftentimes they're expected to just drop everything at any moment and rush to the aid of the parent. and fulfill, even if it's just small, important things. And what this causes to happen is kiddos from this environment can become clingy. They oftentimes are overly nurturing. And they can make a big deal just out of little tiny inconveniences. If they're inconvenienced in the littlest bit, it really becomes this big deal. We also see a lot of complaining and nagging and whining in this environment. There's a lot of emotional reactivity, and they become very sensitive and overly hurt. They want to know every thought and every feeling of another person because, again, I don't know what to think and feel on my own because I'm an extension of you. And so kids are constantly going at their parent's side, trying to figure out what's going on for the parent so that that child knows how that they should feel. But with that, though, they also hold grudges. We're meant to function independently as independent as individual people. And so there's grudges that that child's not able to do that. Also in this system, we've talked a little bit about self-soothing behaviors, but this is the environment where you'll see a lot of the self-soothing behaviors. And while someone from this environment can show sympathy, very rarely will they actually act out empathy. So sympathy would say, "Oh, that's too bad." Empathy would be able to say, "I can relate to that hurt and I can understand why you hurt that way," and to actually feel with somebody else. Other behaviors that we see from this environment are, which makes sense, needing excessive amounts of help, not being able to do things that would be developmentally appropriate. So this is your 8-year-old that still needs someone to help them get dressed and pick out their clothes. Difficulty in just making simple decisions. We talked a little bit about that worry that catastrophes might happen. There's this constant level of worry. Or when they do make efforts, they self-sabotage those efforts. And so it looks like they work below their level of ability. They never have feelings of significance or importance. Again, that comes from that sense of failure that they've always failed. And because they have such a hard time making decisions, they'll procrastinate decision making as well. And they try to avoid any type of independence of making decisions on their own. While they avoid spontaneity as well, there's also a desire to have spontaneity in their life. But again, because they exist as an extension of somebody else, it's difficult to have that spontaneity, so they'll avoid it, especially when you think of that fear of failure or that fear of inadequacy. So our environment 3 is what we call impaired limits. Environment 3, I think, in many ways speaks largely to where we're at as a culture. In environment 3, this is when the caregiving system doesn't draw internal limits for the child. The children tend to be deficient in owning responsibility. They tend to be deficient in creating long-term goals. In this environment, people tend to have difficulty respecting the rights of others. They have difficulties making commitments or even setting realistic personal goals. They might set a very, very lofty goal that someday they're going to be this huge manager of some corporation that they've designed, making millions of dollars, but they will lack the follow-through to actually do what they need to get there. So in these families, they're largely marked by permissiveness. It's parents who are highly permissive, parents who overindulge their children. They're not offering their children direction. What they're doing is they're giving their kids all of these things, and from that comes a sense of superiority within the child. They lack limits in relationship and being able to take responsibility in relationship or being able to reciprocate in relationship. So we talked earlier about that serve and return process that we engage with a child. Because the parents are overindulging the child, that child doesn't know how to reciprocate in that relationship. They don't know how to return back. Some of the behaviors that we see from this environment are children tend to be very dramatic. They move from relationship to relationship, project to project. Again, it's that lack of commitment from thought to thought, and it just almost seems like they're manic at times or restless at times. They really view themselves, they'll boast and they'll brag, and they view themselves as just much greater than they really are. If others are able to perform better than them or more successfully, they might start bullying or making fun of that person. They don't like to be outperformed. They will at times exaggerate their performances, and so if a situation happens, they will make it out to be this huge, grandiose thing of what they did, when maybe the accomplishment wasn't really even that big. They overestimate their own abilities and talents, which sometimes can lead to that lack of commitment, because once you get in there and start working and seeing how hard it is, but you viewed yourself up here above everybody else, it's exhausting, and so they aren't able to commit and follow through with. Children also tend to ignore authority in this. They have a very low level of respect for authority, and they don't respect personal boundaries or even boundaries within the society. They assume that they'll be the center of attention. So if you're at a shindig, if you're at a party, these are your people that will come in and cause themselves to be the center of attention, and that can be through like a flamboyant demeanor, that can be through telling these huge stories, that can be through over-exaggerating the things that they've done. What this can cause too is that sometimes they'll take advantage of other people and they will use manipulation. So our environment 4 we call other-directedness. So other-directedness has an excessive focus on meeting the desires of other people at the expense of one's own needs. So service basically means enslavement. There's this sense that in order to gain your love and approval, I have to serve you. It's required that I serve you. It's very conditional love. It's one's sense of connection is always tentative on serving others. Usually from this environment, there is a lack of awareness of one's own needs or emotional needs. There is even a suppression of one's own emotional needs. I am going to sacrifice my needs in order to serve you. I am forever enslaved to you, indebted to you because I need your love. For the caregiving system, this is I'm going to sacrifice my family's needs. I'm not going to be available to my children because I have to go serve these people. I have to try and find that conditional acceptance. I have to serve others. So typically in the family, it's a very conditional acceptance. The children are expected to suppress who they are, just important aspects of themselves, in order to gain the love and approval of the caregivers. If you aren't serving, if you aren't sacrificing part of who you are, then I'm going to withhold affection. I'm going to withhold love. We also see that there's an expectation that the child will focus on the caregiver, the parent's needs and preferences. The child isn't allowed to have their own needs and preferences. The child has to heed to that of the caregiving system. So oftentimes what happens is environment 3 and environment 4, the overindulgent or the one without limits, is a perfect match for the other directedness, because environment 3 from that becomes this almost grandiose, I'm so good and everybody should care for my needs. And the other directedness, this 4th environment, is more I'm going to always care for everybody else's needs. And so in many ways it could be a match made in heaven, although it may not be really healthy for either person in that relationship. So some of the behaviors that we see in the environment for the other directedness is people from this environment can be overly nurturing, always sacrificing themselves, overly compliant. But while they are very, very nurturing, internally what's going on from them is that they have this sense of that they're flawed or that they're broken. They're not able to protect themselves or to be assertive, and so they're taken advantage of a lot. So again, consider our environment 3 are the ones that take advantage, and our environment 4s are the ones that get taken advantage of. They feel as though they can't be assertive in their relationships. They just heed to whatever is told or whatever is expected of them, because they are trying so hard to gain that acceptance and that love. They fear having who they are truly discovered. They fear that people will know that they are inherently flawed or broken. They don't have any sense of power to keep others from hurting them or from being taken advantage of. And in many ways, they feel as though they're a victim in these relationships. The belief is, I must take care of others or I will never be loved. If I don't take care of love, there won't be, if I don't take care of others, there will not be love for me. And so I'm not as good as other people. And so I have to take care of them. I might not be as able or as intelligent and so on. They also people from this environment tend to get anxious when they're alone. They don't do well with a lot of downtime. And they choose relationships which will dominate them. So they don't want to be alone. They want to be in a relationship, but they're going to choose that environment 3 type of relationship, people that will take control and dominate and take advantage. And even in that, they'll become overly compliant in those relationships. For them, though, relationships really are more about the social exchange. It's not this mutual relationship. It's not this reciprocal relationship. It's just about the social engage. And so there's really this lack of vulnerability. They're not able to express who they truly are and allow people to know who they truly are. They tend to minimize or deny certain parts of their character and put themselves down. The opposite of our environment 3 that over-exaggerated their abilities, our environment 4 will exaggerate their negative characteristics. They won't take well to compliments or deny compliments or turn them down. We saw this again, I believe, in environment 2, but much like environment 2, they think of the worst possible outcomes. And they avoid sometimes relationships altogether, just feeling like any relationship is unsafe. And when they do engage in relationships, they're definitely not offering vulnerability in it. So they tend to be on guard for any type of real or perceived demand of others. And sometimes those demands can be seen as threats. They tend to have low expectations. You remember some of our past environments had high expectations. Our environment 1 had very high expectations that couldn't be met. Well, our environment 2 has very, very low expectations. And they just will automatically expect that they will be disappointed or let down. Very easily manipulated. They will become angry when others do not reciprocate or acknowledge their sacrifice, and sometimes act unrealistically in that as well. We talked earlier a little bit about dissociation, and in this environment we'll see aspects of dissociation where they just seem as though reality is just is closed off for them. So our 5th and final type of our 5th environment is called our overvigilance and inhibition environment. This environment really is marked by an excessive emphasis on suppressing spontaneity in feelings or impulses, suppressing spontaneity and making choices. This environment tends to be very rigid and focused highly on rules and expectations about performance and meeting ethical behaviors. There is the thought that performance is much more important than happiness, is much more important than creativity or relationship or self-expression. I like to think of this environment, oftentimes it's called the overperformance environment. I like to think of this environment as families who have their child in gymnastics 8 days a week when there's only 7 days a week, and that child is to get straight A's no matter what, because if you bring home an A-, you will be punished for that. So in the family of origin, they tend to be punitive and demanding. When those rigid expectations aren't met, those children will be punished for it. And their performance must always meet that high standard of the caregiving system. Duty and perfectionism, so achieving that duty or holding committed to that duty and doing everything perfectly is very highly prized in the family of origin. They must hide emotions, they must avoid mistakes, and they must always follow the rules. Where we tend to see this environment come from is from religious groups that are highly rigid and from military families, because there's this rigid mindset about the rules and the focus on the rules and the focus on the performance. Because of that high focus on the rules and the performance, any type of joy, pleasure, relaxation, creativity are not valued, oftentimes being seen as laziness. What comes from this environment, though, are people who are critical and criticize others often. They're never satisfied. They tend to be perfectionistic, very picky about relationships, picky about their things, picky about way things are done, and they really want everything to be perfectionistic. They use anger as an instrument. So rather than anger being a function of what's going on for me internally, they'll use anger as a punishment. They'll use anger to let other people in their family know that that person is not performing. And so it's that instrument to curb behavior. It's that instrument to try and get someone to perform better. They will blame others and rarely take responsibility for themselves. And they will make demeaning or devaluing comments to other people. Again, this creates this sense of shame, but I think internally what's going on for them is if I demean and devalue you enough, you'll meet that expectation, you'll start performing more. They also themselves, while being critical, tend to be hypersensitive to slights and to criticism. They don't like to be criticized, and they will manipulate as well. There's a huge emphasis on order and on reason. Again, spontaneity is not valued in these environments. They feel like they must be in control. Perfectionism actually is a really great way to gain control. When people have to have things perfect or in or done just a certain way, sometimes internally that's what helps them to have that sense of control. And when you think even back to our levels of safety, so we have our third level, which is our passive system. One of the ways that children gain a sense of control in their life is by doing things perfectly. So this is actually a marker of this environment, is to be in control and to have that sense of perfectionism. They will try to draw other people's attention to kind of like see my accomplishments. And so people from this environment are constantly talking about the things that they've done, all of their accomplishments, all of the things that they'll be doing, all of these performances and how well and how perfectly they've done them. And they really have that expectation that other people will acknowledge those accomplishments. They will act overtly punishing towards others. So just really forward and direct in punishing. And they can actually say hurtful and cruel things at times. And they'll use harshness and criticism or sarcasm when they do that. And even bullying at times. So those are our five toxic family environments. And as you listen to those, you might even find yourself kind of giggling, saying, yeah, that's me, I've got that one. But the way we bring this back is to say, one, the environment is so important. And you might find elements from different environments about, this one was maybe how I was with my dad, and maybe this one was how I was with my mom, or this one I was with my caregiver. And what's likely to occur is now as you parent, you'll start seeing some of those things play out. So you might find that if you came from a limited impairment, the environment 3, that maybe when your kids are having a rough day, rather than being emotionally supportive of them, you are overindulging them with stuff because that's how you were raised. So now we have our own selves coming from these environments, and we bring kids into foster care, and suddenly these two worlds collide. So if you take those environments, and then we go back to what we had learned in an earlier module about negative belief systems, and we start matching negative belief systems with different environments, we are now begin to form our own negative belief system of things that might have occurred in our own life. So if you're from environment 4, the belief system might be, I'm never going to be adequate. Well, now we bring in a child with their own negative belief system, and we've got these belief systems now interacting with each other. I actually call it the crazy cycle. So let me give you a little example of what the crazy cycle looks like. Let's say that you have a child who believes, I will never belong. And one of the ways that they communicate to other people that they never belong is by raging. Well, let's say that we have an adult from environment 4 who has the negative belief, I'll never be adequate. And this child rages and rages, and what happens is that child's behavior now triggers the adult's negative belief. And so that adult will react. And that adult may react by yelling because they feel so overwhelmed. And when that adult yells, they really validate for that child, you're right, you don't belong. Another way that even beyond the environments that we can really understand what our own negative belief system is by sitting down and just going over a basic timeline for ourselves and saying, okay, this happened here, what would any reasonable person believe? Just like we would do and extend that same compassion for the children that we're caring for, we can extend that compassion for ourselves and say, what are the possible negative beliefs that I have, and what am I doing, what am I using behaviorally to communicate that that's going on for me? Because again, those are going to interact with the child. So let's go back to our case example. Let's say that we have our 5-year-old boy. Again, dad's incarcerated, mom was using substances, there's neglect, possible physical abuse, and we determine that child's negative belief is, I will never be safe. Now we place that child in a foster home, and the foster home are really nice people. But let's say that foster mom had her own rough upbringing. Let's say that her family environment was very, very chaotic. And so she has a high level, a high need for control. So this child is acting out his sense of belonging, his need for belonging through rages and aggression. And when he rages and has aggression, that parent who has this heightened level need for control because of her own chaotic environment is now going to try to do whatever she can to stop that child from feeling, to stop that child from raging. And so she, in an effort, is just pushing back against that child, which is validating for that child again that I will never have a sense of belonging. I'm not going to be safe and I'm not going to belong. This child also likely has a very low level of tolerance. So this child's not going to be able to tolerate other people's emotions, other people's affect, as much as a child raised in a healthy environment. So this foster mother, when she got overwhelmed by this lack of sense of control with her own biological children, she could come at them with the angry eyebrows, and they could tolerate that because they had stability in their life. They had the foundation of their life had good enough parenting. For this child that has no window of tolerance, when she comes at him with the angry eyebrows, he can't tolerate that. And what that sends to him is, you are not safe. People are here to hurt you and you are rejected.